All right, let's talk about this. Back in 1979, way before the internet as we know it, before social media, a philosopher was asked to write a report on the state of knowledge. But what he wrote, wow, it wasn't just a report. It was an absolutely stunning prediction of the chaotic, information-drenched world we live in right now. He called it the postmodern condition. And honestly, if you want to understand our own time, you've got to understand this.
And this one sentence, this is the key that unlocks the whole thing. Postmodernism, he says, is basically just incredulity toward meta-narratives. So what does that even mean? In simple terms, it means we've stopped believing in the big, sweeping stories that used to give us all a shared sense of purpose and truth. That skepticism, that feeling of, I don't buy that anymore. That's the core of the postmodern condition.
And that really is the big question, isn't it? To get a handle on our present moment, why our institutions feel so shaky, why truth itself feels like it's up for grabs, we first have to understand which stories fell apart. And maybe even more importantly, what came rushing in to fill that vacuum. So Lyotard's big argument is that the entire modern era, from the Enlightenment on, was really built on a foundation of what he calls meta-narratives. And we're not talking about just any stories. These were the grand, all-encompassing stories that gave meaning to absolutely everything, from science and politics to our entire social lives. You can almost think of them like society's main operating system. These meta-narratives were the ultimate justification for everything. They answered the huge why questions. Why should we pursue science? Why follow these laws? And the answer always pointed back to the same thing, because it serves the grand story of progress. Lyotard really zeroes in on two of these massive stories that he says basically ran Western civilization for centuries. First, you have the political one, this powerful belief that knowledge would eventually lead to freedom and justice for every single person. And then you have the philosophical one, the epic quest to unite all knowledge into one perfect, complete system. Both of these stories promised a kind of final destination for society. But then, the 20th century happened. You have devastating world wars, the rise of totalitarianism, the sheer complexity of modern life, and all of a sudden, those big universal promises started to ring pretty hollow. Faith in these grand projects just crumbled. And that collapse, that void where their authority used to be, that's the heart of the postmodern condition. So, when those huge foundational pillars just crumble, what are you left with? Well, you get what Lyotard identifies as the central problem, a massive crisis of legitimation.
Legitimation, it's a fancy word, but it really boils down to one simple question. Says who? It's the whole process that gives a scientist the authority to say this is true, or a politician the authority to say this is just. And for centuries, the answer to says who was always one of those big meta-narratives.
But think about it. If you don't believe in the grand story of universal human freedom anymore, then how do you decide which laws are actually fair? If we've given up on the idea that all knowledge fits into one perfect puzzle, then how do we decide which scientific research is valuable or even true? The old rulebooks are gone.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it exposes the core dilemma. Without a grand story to hide behind, that raw link between knowledge and power is laid bare for everyone to see. The question changes from what is true to who gets to decide what's true. Suddenly, it's not so much about philosophy anymore. It becomes a raw game of power and control. So you have this vacuum of legitimacy, right? And into that void steps a brand new, powerful logic, one driven by technology in the market. And Lyotard, with incredible foresight, saw exactly how this was all going to play out. With the dawn of computers and databanks, the whole idea of what knowledge even is starts to shift. It's no longer this deep thing you internalize to become a better, wiser person. Nope. It becomes something you can process, you can store, and crucially, you can turn into digital bits of information. And this process, this is what Lyotard calls the commodification of knowledge. It's basically stripped of its old purpose and repackaged for the marketplace. Anything that can't be easily translated this way starts to look useless. Its value isn't about truth or making society better anymore. It's about utility. It's about performance. This is a massive tectonic shift in thinking. We go from that classic ideal of Bildung, the idea that knowledge actually shapes who you are as a person, to a totally new principle where knowledge is just a product. It's not about cultivating your mind, it's about creating value that can be bought and sold. And just like that, you have a new rule for what makes something legitimate. The question isn't, is it true or is it just anymore? The new question is it useful? Is it efficient? Does it optimize the system's performance?
This logic, which he calls performativity, starts to dictate everything, from what research gets funding to what kids are taught in school. The new mantra is, be operational, be efficient, or get out of the way.
Okay, so after painting this pretty bleak picture, you might be wondering, what's the solution? Where do we go from here? Well, Lyotard says we can't go back to those old failed meta-narratives, but we also shouldn't just surrender to this cold logic of efficiency. He actually proposes a totally different path forward.
To explain his idea, he borrows this really cool concept from another philosopher, Wittgenstein, called the language game. The basic idea is that society isn't one big unified thing. It's more like a huge network of different games. Think of it this way. Science has its own set of rules, right? Art has a totally different set. So does politics. Each one is its own game with its own unique rules for what counts as a valid move.
Now, this idea puts Lyotard in a direct clash with another huge thinker of the time, Jürgen Habermas. See, Habermas believed we could find a new foundation for society in a perfect, rational consensus. Lyotard thought this was a terrible, even dangerous idea. For him, demanding that everyone agree is a form of terror that just silences different points of view. He said the goal shouldn't be agreement, it should be to find those productive, interesting disagreements.
And that brings us to his big answer, paradoxy. Instead of trying to get everyone on the same page, we should actually value dissent. Instead of aiming for stability, we should actively look for paradoxes and make those unexpected, rule-breaking moves in the game. This is where the real magic happens. For Lyotard, all the cool stuff, scientific breakthroughs, real social justice, it doesn't come from everybody agreeing. It comes from that creative spark of dissent.
So let's step back. Why are we talking about a philosophy book from 1979? Why does it feel so incredibly relevant right now? Because in so many ways, Lyotard wasn't just describing his world. He was basically writing a prophecy for ours. I mean, just think about it for a second. The idea of one single truth shattering into a million competing narratives online? Sound familiar? How about the global power struggle over data? Or that relentless pressure for absolutely everything, education, healthcare, you name it, to be efficient and economically justifiable? This isn't abstract philosophy. It's literally the world we live in every single day. Lyotard basically drew the blueprint.
And that brings us to the huge, vital question that Lyotard leaves hanging in the air for us. In a world that runs on data, in a system that values performance above all else, where does justice fit in? Who gets to be the one to challenge the rules, to invent something new, to make that next unexpected move? That, right there, is the postmodern challenge. And it's a question we are all still struggling to answer.